All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into Arizona's first-degree murder law. We're going to break down the whole legal process, the one that decides between life in prison or the death penalty.
So how do we get there? Well, to really get a handle on it, we've got to start at the beginning. How does Arizona law even define this crime? It's a really structured process, so let's walk through it together. Okay, so first things first. First-degree murder isn't just one thing. The law actually lays out three completely different ways someone can end up with this charge. And, getting a grasp on these three paths is pretty much step one.
And this is a big deal. The law calls it a Class 1 felony, which is the absolute most severe category of crime in the state. Right from the get-go, that label, Class 1 felony, tells everyone involved that the stakes couldn't be higher.
Now, let's zoom in on that second one, felony murder. Premeditated murder and murder of an officer, those are pretty clear, right? But felony murder is, well, it's a whole different beast. It's way broader and can cover a ton of different situations you might not expect.
And here's what's really wild about felony murder. The prosecution doesn't actually have to prove the person intended to kill anyone. Nope. All they have to prove is that they intended to commit the other serious crime like the robbery. So think about that. If a death happens during a robbery, even if it was a total accident, it can still be charged as first-degree murder. That's a game changer.
So let's say a person is convicted. The trial isn't over, not by a long shot. The court then moves into this super critical sentencing phase, where the outcomes are, well, they're worlds apart. And this is where the jury's job gets incredibly tough.
And you might think a life sentence is just a life sentence, but it's not that simple. Turns out there are two kinds. Natural life, that's exactly what you think it is. No parole, no release, ever. But a standard life sentence, that's different. It actually comes with a possibility of release, but only after serving a really long, mandatory minimum sentence.
So for that life sentence, that minimum is 25 years, provided the victim was 15 years old or older. But if the victim was younger than 15, that minimum sentence jumps up to 35 years. So how does a jury make that monumental decision between life and death? Well, they have to weigh very specific factors that are laid out in the law. It's almost like they're balancing a scale. This isn't supposed to be about gut feelings or emotion. It's a methodical, step-by-step process of looking at the evidence from both sides. And the key to it all comes down to two opposing sets of circumstances. The law has names for them: aggravating factors and mitigating factors. The jury's entire job at this stage is to put them on that scale and see which side is heavier. Okay, so aggravating factors. Think of these as weights the prosecution adds to the death penalty side of the scale. And they have a huge burden of proof. They have to prove these factors exist beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard in our legal system.
And these are just a handful of examples, by the way. There's a whole list in the Arizona statutes. Each one is a very specific, legally defined thing that the state can argue makes the crime that much worse.
So on the other side of the scale, you have the mitigating circumstances. These are the counterweights the defense presents to argue for leniency, for a life sentence. And check this out. The burden of proof is lower here. It's a preponderance of the evidence, which basically just means more likely than not. What's really interesting is that any single juror can consider any factor they believe is mitigating. It doesn't matter if the other 11 jurors disagree. This really opens the door for a personal look at the defendant's life, their character, their background, the whole picture. So it all boils down to this one crucial test. To hand down a death sentence, every single juror has to agree that those mitigating circumstances, all the reasons for leniency, are just not strong enough to outweigh the aggravating ones. Now, this whole weighing process doesn't even happen during the main trial. It's a completely separate, two-part proceeding that only starts after the jury has already delivered a guilty verdict. And that's by design, right? It makes sure the jury is focused on one thing at a time. First, are they guilty? And only then, what's the punishment? This two-phase system is like a critical firewall. Think about it. If the prosecution can't get all 12 jurors to agree on even one aggravating factor in that first phase, the whole thing stops. The death penalty is immediately off the table, and the sentence is life. End of story. You can just feel how immense the jury's role is here, right? And the law has these super specific rules for how they have to make their decision. The entire system really is built on this one core idea, unanimity. And that's an incredibly high bar to clear. Every single juror has to agree.
It just shows you the weight of the decision. But it also brings up a pretty big question.
Right. So what happens if they can't all agree? What if just one juror holds out? That's called a hung jury, and the law has a very clear plan for what happens next. The process doesn't just grind to a halt because of one person.
So if that happens, the judge declares a mistrial for the sentencing part, and they impanel a whole new jury. This new group of people then hears all the evidence again and tries to reach a unanimous verdict on the sentence. They're not redeciding guilt or innocence, just the punishment. And yeah, this means the state basically gets a second bite at the apple.
But what if the second jury also can't agree? Well, that's it. The process stops. And this is a really important safeguard in the system. The law is crystal clear. If the state can't unanimously convince two separate juries, the judge has no choice. They must impose a life sentence. So that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. When a legal process is this detailed, this structured, does that guarantee the outcome is always just? The law provides a very specific roadmap. But at the end of the day, the final destination is decided by 12 people, wrestling with some of the biggest questions of justice there are. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.